everybody. My name is Karen Voss, and I am a senior editor at Charlesbridge Publishing. And I'm so glad to be here today with these two wonderful authors to talk about nonfiction experts and working with the people who know all the things when you're writing nonfiction for kids.
Great. Thank you, Karen. So my name is Loree Burns, and my first career was as a molecular biologist and biochemist. So it's probably not too surprising that my second career as a children's book writer is focused heavily on the natural world and how it works and how we humans know what we know about how it works. I love to write about scientists and their work, and I love to remind kids in my books that you don't have to be a grown-up or have a fancy laboratory in order to actually do science. So the two books that I wrote most recently for Charlesbridge are first, You're Invited to a Mothball, which came out in 2020 with photographs by Ellen Harris-Samowich. And that book is an introduction to the art and science of nighttime moth watching. And it's really a how-to. My goal with that book was to let readers and their adults know that there's a whole world going on outside at night after we go to sleep. And it's really easy with a few simple tricks to get to know the moths that are living where you live. And then in the next month, I have another book coming that's called Honeybee Rescue. And that is a peek inside a honeybee hive. And when I say a peek, I mean a really up close look into a single hive. Again, illustrations by Ellen Harris-Samowich. And in that book, we follow the story of a colony that built its home in a garage, a honeybee colony. And the man who owned that garage wanted to move those bees out, of course, because who wants to park a car under 75,000 honeybees? And also, he was a beekeeper, and he knew that those bees really came originally from his backyard apiary. So this book is the story of how he got them from the garage back to the apiary.
Excellent.
Hi, I'm Michelle Cusolito, and Loree and I have very similar interests in our writing. My first career after college was working as a naturalist at an environmental camp, and then I went on to be an elementary school teacher where I did lots of science experiences with my students. We went out on field trips and were outside often, so I like to write about the same sorts of things that I used to like to teach about. My first book with Charlesbridge was called Flying Deep, Climb Inside Deep Sea Submersible Alvin. And the seed idea of for that book actually started when I was a teacher. I met someone in a social gathering who used to be an Alvin, a pilot of Alvin, which is a submersible that goes deep into the ocean to do exploration. And I invited him to my classroom to share his experiences with my students, and they were really into it, and so was I. So that was a natural progression for me to write a book about that. That book features beautiful illustrations by Nicole Wong, as does the second book that I have with Charlesbridge called Diving Deep, Using Machines to Explore the Ocean. And where Flying Deep looks specifically at one vehicle called Alvin, Diving Deep examines the variety of ways that humans explore the ocean, starting with snorkeling, and then as you turn the pages, you get deeper and deeper into the ocean until you reach Challenger Deep, the deepest place in the ocean.
So let's get to the topic at hand, which really is working with experts when you're writing nonfiction for kids. Melissa Stewart talks sometimes about how there's this incorrect notion that kids don't like nonfiction books, and they certainly do, and I loved them as a kid, and I think probably you both loved them as a kid. But when you write nonfiction for children, one of the most important things that we think at Charlesbridge is that everything in there has to be exactly correct, because if a kid is coming across a topic for the first time in a picture book, we want them to not walk away from that first exposure to something with misconceptions or misinformation or incomplete information, because that may be where they have now, for the rest of their life, they're going to remember that fact from that book that they learned when they were 8. So that means that expert readers become a huge part of the process. And the two of you particularly, I think, work really closely and really well with expert readers and experts on your books. So how did you decide to write about honeybee rescues, and how did you decide to write about deep ocean or ocean exploration in general? And through how you decided to do that, where did the experts sort of come in right from the beginning? Because I know that that's the case with both of you.
Yeah, so while I was working on Flying Deep, I worked very closely with Bruce Strickrott, who is the chief Alvin pilot and manager of the Alvin Group, and he was really key in me getting the facts correct for the book, but also bringing in all of the little details that I wouldn't know if I hadn't talked to Bruce and also gone inside Alvin. And after that book was completed, Bruce and I maintained a connection with each other. We did some events, and he said to me, "I think we need a book about all these different ways humans explore the ocean." And I was like, how could I make that happen? And I even talked with you, Karen, about it very early on in the process. This idea of exploring the different ways humans access the ocean. So he was involved right from the beginning and then continued to be involved. He helped me fact check the information later. And I also pulled in some other experts along the way who help with different aspects because Bruce has a very particular expertise in Alvin and a few other vehicles, whereas I needed some biologists and some other scientists to help with some of the other content in the book as well.
I think also Bruce had really little children at that time, and he was
Yeah.
like, I want a book for my kid that's all about the different ways that we can explore the ocean. And so I love that you not only had Bruce as an expert on another book, but then maintained the relationship that then kind of became the genesis of another book. I think that
Right.
that's sort of the ideal of what can happen when you create those relationships with experts. Loree, how about you? How did Honeybee Rescue come to happen, and how did experts play into that?
So for me, I had written another book about honeybees. It's called The Hive Detectives, and that's a book for sort of upper elementary and middle grade readers. But what I found when I went to schools was I ended up talking about honeybees to younger students as well, kindergartners, first graders, second graders. And all the time, I could just, those kids are just as interested in honeybees, just as curious about what's going on in their hive, just as curious about what they can do to sort of get to know the bees where they live, but also make sure that bees are happy and healthy and protected and all those things. And so I have wanted since the Hive Detectives came out to find a story that would allow me to bring readers once again into a hive, but a story that would be much easier for a younger audience instead of the older audience I'd already written for. And so this is where kind of a little bit of serendipity comes in. I was having my house painted, and the painter noticed that I have honeybee hives in my yard, and he asked me, or he told me the story about another house he was painting that very day, that they'd had to halt the job because they found a hive of honeybees living in the roof, and the bees wouldn't let anyone near the house, the roof, for painting. And I was, of course, very curious. I wanted to know more. He said that instead of exterminating those bees, the homeowners had found a beekeeper to come and move them. And I said, of course, the obvious thing, can you introduce me to these homeowners? And so he did. And I went the very next day to their home as this beekeeper came and moved the bees from the third floor roof of their house into a hive box. And that's when I met my expert, John Nelson. And I knew as I watched him do what he did, that this was that story that would allow me to explore the life of the honeybee for a younger audience. And I also knew that he was probably the perfect person to play double duty. He's certainly an expert beekeeper, and he knows everything that I needed to know in order to tell this story to young people. But he also became the star of the book because his work, one of his rescues, became the narrative on which this whole book is built.
So both of you then had a main expert that was really like the biggest part of the process, but each of you also had a bunch of other experts that were involved. So I think that a lot of times when people are working on nonfiction or on things that need someone to read it, they sort of think that they might only need just the one person. That person knows enough to make sure that the stuff is right. So can you talk a little bit about why both of you ended up with all these other folks?
So I think the really simple answer to that question is none of us want to get anything wrong, right? None of us want to publish something for children that's inaccurate. First of all, you don't want kids to walk away from your book with the wrong information, but we all also are professionals who want, our work to be accurate. And so So for me, I'm constantly wanting folks to check the accuracy of the material, so content wise, but I'm also interested in people who have expertise in other areas that I don't have expertise, like elementary school education, for example. So I tend to find readers, try and find readers that are in my content area. So in this case, honeybees and beekeeping, and and then also in the educational arena. And I've built up relationships and a network of people that I draw on time and time again, sort of like you were talking about, Michelle, with this person that you've worked with, through this scientist that you've worked with through several books. So one of my expert content area readers for Honeybee Rescue was a woman named Mary Duane. She's the president, or is now the former president of the Worcester County Beekeepers Association, which is an organization where I live in central Massachusetts. And she actually was someone who featured prominently in that first book that I wrote about honeybees. And so I knew that she had the expertise that I needed. She's not only a beekeeper, but an educator. So I asked her if she would read this new manuscript for me, again, looking for content accuracy as far as bees and bee lives and bee life cycles and beekeeping, but also as an educator who works with young people, someone who would understand whether the storytelling was hitting the right mark and that kind of thing. So I look for people in both areas. And as my career has progressed, I sort of have this network that I draw on time and time again.
Yeah, so a lot of the same things that Loree just said apply. I am a former educator myself, so I don't necessarily need to rely on an educator perspective because I bring that myself. But in terms of building a network of scientists that I work with, I think while Loree was talking, I was thinking of a slightly different aspect that comes from having experts that maybe I could focus on is, for example, when I was researching Flying Deep, the first person I spoke to was a retired pilot because we met socially, and we just started chatting. And he mentioned to me in our conversation that something about listening to music while he was piloting Alvin. And I sort of thought if that was an interesting detail and kind of disregarded it. But then when I was talking with Bruce later and I was really in the nitty gritty research, he mentioned music. And my researcher, like, little flag went off, like, wait a minute, there's something interesting here. And I was able to ask him more questions about that and learn that really music features pretty heavily in nearly all dives, that it becomes an integral part of the experience of diving in Alvin. So that went into the book. And in a similar vein with Diving Deep, my newest book, I talk about Aquarius, which is an underwater space where humans can live and do research. And I talked to a person who does scuba diving, but also did saturation diving, which is the specialized kind of diving that's needed to live in Aquarius. And he told me about these giant groupers that would come right up to the viewport and watch them while they were eating. And I thought that was such an interesting detail that never would have made its way into the manuscript if my expert hadn't told me that detail. So the person who's been there and done the work brings experiences that make the story come more alive when I add those details to my writing.
Fantastic. So I feel like one of the other things that happens whenever I work with manuscripts that need to be expert read is that a lot of times, it's with the two of you in particular, you had the manuscripts looked at ahead before I even ever saw them. Then we started to work on them and it was like, okay, when do we show the experts again? Because we've made some changes and we've adjusted some things. And in some cases, like, plot might change a little or whatever, and that might change details. So we always have this sort of, when do we next, quote unquote, bother the experts, right? Because it's their time that we're asking for them to look at this again. Should they look at sketches? When should they do that? Should they look at the art when it comes in? And I think that always becomes a balancing act, right? Of not only how often are we bothering and asking for their time, and the timing of making the book. Right?
So in the case of Diving Deep, we had experts look at that 3 separate times. So as Karen just mentioned, we did that before copy edits. And then once Nicole did her first beautiful sketches, we actually had experts look at the sketches at that phase. And a couple of people, I had some experts in fish, deep ocean fish, take a look at it, and they gave some tiny notes about Nicole's illustrations. Like first and foremost, they said these sketches are amazing, but one of my experts said the six-gilled shark, that sixth gill should be a little longer, and on the hatchet fish, the other expert commented that it's a kind of fish that has looks like a hatchet, an indentation cut out of its head, sort of. That should go a little deeper in, is basically what the comment was. And so Nicole was able to receive that information and tweak her illustrations, which they were thrilled with right from the beginning. But that was the level of detail that went into the checking of the sketch phase. Then once the art was totally finished, everything went back to them again for a final check, text and art all together for a final check. And they were, I think at that point, nothing significant came back from experts at that phase.
Yeah, so I do love that. I remember that the hatchet fish in particular, because I think when that note came back, Diane and I are both, Diane was the designer for the book, and we both went and Googled hatchet fish, and we're like looking at the little indentation in its head, and we're like, okay, we need to, and it's really, really important, I think, to get that level of detail right, because it makes the book that much better. And Loree, yours is different because you're working with photographs, right? So your partner in making your book is not drawing something that they had to figure out how to make it look correct, right? Because she's taking photos, but it still becomes, you still had those experts look at the layouts.
Yes, and if you remember, at the very last minute, after all the experts had looked at things and signed off, and we'd all signed off, and we were very ready to push send and get these books printed, there was one image that it suddenly it struck me as the bees in it that we were calling honeybees they looked weird to me. Do you remember this?
Yes.
And suddenly I was sending that photo to everybody that I could that knew honeybees and said, could these not be honeybees? Like, we thought these were honeybees, but I don't think these are honeybees. Look at how long their antenna are, da 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 da. And long, very scary story short, they weren't honeybees. And at the last moment, we had to swap out that photo for one that was actually honeybees. Bees, I mean, there are thousands of species of bees, right? Or hundreds at least. And we just happened to have a photo that Ellen thought it was a honeybee when she took the photo. I thought it was a honeybee when she gave me the photo. And it wasn't honeybees on it. It was a type of sweat bee that looks just like a honeybee. So, all of which makes me think, after hearing Michelle's response and then my response, things get by us. It's very, very difficult, but we have so many of these steps in place to minimize that so that everything is as accurate as we can possibly make it.
Yeah. So that just means that other bee was hanging out around the same day that all those honeybees were being moved.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, and that's the other piece, I think, is that I think a lot of people don't know that a lot of times stuff happens until the last moment, and you sort of say, wait, I can't believe we all missed this. But the thing that I always remind myself, because I don't know that I could do this job if I didn't remind myself very often, that we are all human people who, are, and humans are, as we know, prone to make mistakes and prone to miss things. So that's one of the reasons that we do have so many layers of checks to make sure before we do press send and make the books and even if there is an error in a book, there are always ways to change it and update it for the next printing, which we will do all the time. We sometimes get notes from outside folks who say, hey, this is a thing that we noticed in this book. Is this correct? And then you go back to the author and say, hey, this reader said this thing. And it's like, oh my gosh, like, how did we all miss that? So
yeah,
go ahead.
I don't know if you have this, Michelle. I have a top secret list of little things that got by me that we fixed. We've fixed in subsequent printings. But if you have a first edition, you might have the extra fancy tiny little error in it.
Exactly.
So I tell my friends and family, you have the really special early editions.
It still has the little mistake. Yeah, there you go. So tell me what you think is the most valuable thing that your experts brought to creating these two books.
Yeah, well, what I'm going to say is I think Michelle nailed it when she said authenticity. I mean, I think that what I look to experts to get, and I'm lucky because I'm often writing about things that I have access to, unlike a deep sea submersible, right? You can't go in and go down. But
Yeah.
I'm, you know, when you're writing about honeybees, I can go out in the field and watch these scientists as they're doing their thing. It's those details. It's those little details like the ones Michelle mentioned, the captains listening to music. Just the hearing the language that the beekeepers use when they're talking to one another, or the scientists use, seeing how they hold the tools, seeing how they treat the tools when they're done for the day. Those little things that I would never get to see and then include in my manuscript, if I wasn't there and watching, or if I didn't have those experts to tell me that that's how they do it. That's what makes these books feel, I hope, for readers like they're out there too.
That's awesome. How about
Yeah.
you, Michelle? What's the most valuable thing do you think that the experts
Yeah.
bring?
The first word that came to my mind was also authenticity. And so, like Loree, as much as possible, I try to experience the things that I can when I'm writing about them. So, for in the writing of Diving Deep, for example, I learned to scuba dive. I didn't know before, and my whole family went and learned scuba diving because that's one of the spreads involves scuba diving. And so, I can't go on a deep sea dive in Alvin, but I have been inside of Alvin, and that was really important for my understanding of how Alvin works, how it feels to be in that space. And Bruce turned on the oxygen so I could hear the sound, and that sound got in my manuscript. He showed me how they use those manipulator arms to grab things and collect specimens. So even though I wasn't under the ocean, I was able to experience the space of Alvin. And then a lot of it was, like I mentioned, interviewing. So, for example, I don't free dive. There's free diving in the book, but I have a friend who teaches free diving, and I spoke to him, and I watched dozens of hours of people free diving to get a sense of what that's like. And it's one page in my book, but I read a whole book about it. Like, I did a ton of research for that one double page spread in the book. So all of those details are very important, and they come from reading, but more importantly, getting right out there and doing some of it, what I can on my own, and getting details from the experts.
Yeah, that's great. So, Loree, the activity guide that Charlesbridge made to go with Honeybee Rescue includes an activity that teachers can do with kids, or librarians can do with kids, where they invite somebody in who's an expert to ask them questions about their thing. And that's really based on the fact that John is featured in your book, right? He's not just an expert you worked with to make sure the book was correct, but the book follows John as he moves these honeybees back to a hive. And there's an interview with him in the back of your book as well, asking him really specific questions. And so I totally think it's great that created this activity that teachers or librarians could do with kids. I'm curious what you two think that kids should know about experts in the books that they're reading, right? So what do you think gatekeepers like teachers and parents and librarians and such should share with kids to help them learn about why expert knowledge is always important?
Yeah, you know, I think I probably would tweak this a little bit too, Karen, and say, this is something that I think that, you know, that gatekeepers and teachers and parents can think about when they're sharing nonfiction with kids, but also that kids who are writing nonfiction, right? The kids are writing stories or learning to write through telling their own stories in very, very early on. And so I think the thing that I would mention is that the definition of what makes an expert is super broad.
Mm.
So certainly if you're writing about honeybees and you can find somebody who keeps bees, that's going to be great for you because you'll have some insight into the world of honeybees that you might not yet have on your own. But that doesn't mean it has to be a honeybee scientist. There could be beekeepers in your neighborhood. There could be beekeepers in your family. There could be friends. Some of your friends may have beekeepers in their family. So just broadening this idea of what an expert is, really you're just looking for someone who can give you some insights into this topic that you either don't have on your own or that you need more of. And so really that can be, the experts are everywhere, I guess is my point. And I think that's important for young writers, especially to understand. We talk to an activity like that in that field, activity guide it's wonderful. And I hope it will get young writers thinking about who they could talk to get those authentic details that Michelle and I have been talking about, which are so important to making writing really engaging. very, very young writers can do that, and broadening who they think of as experts is one good way to get them to make that more accessible to them.
That's excellent. And Michelle, I know that you talk about sometimes when you talk with other writers who want to write nonfiction about when it's time to go to the expert. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit in terms of kids and when. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you are a kid and you're writing about bees, like Loree was just proposing, and your parents are or neighbors are beekeepers, maybe you're going to talk to them right away at the beginning of the project. But if you're going to be reaching out to someone who you don't know, you really want to be prepared for that exchange. Just like when I'm writing a book, I don't, most of the time, this experience was different, as you heard, because Bruce was involved kind of early on. But generally, I don't contact an expert until I've done as much research I can do on my own to learn the subject matter. I don't want to be asking the expert questions that I could have answered myself. What I want to get from them are the details that I can't find in the research. Try not to ask the basic questions that you could get from a book or a website or a video, something like that, or that you might learn on your own. That's another kind of expert that I think Loree would agree with me about, is you can become an expert on something by going outside in your own yard and observing and writing about it. I once drafted an entire manuscript by doing research myself. I did all the research and did the observations, and later had a scientist fact check that manuscript for me. So a student could observe, for example, if they live near the ocean and they might want to write about animals in tide pools, they could be observing. Or if they have a garden, you could keep a record of what you're growing and how long it takes to sprout, things like that. Those are all ways that you personally could get your own details too.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I
So
love that answer, Michelle.
yeah, that's great. So the one last thing I want to say is both of your books are appropriate for younger audiences for sure. But one of the things that I love about books like yours and most nonfiction picture books I ever see is that they also are usable right up into high school, right? Where you sort of say to a classroom of students, we're going to read all these picture books, and then you're going to choose some nugget that's in this picture book and go do more research about whatever that thing is, right? So if a seventh grader or a 10th grader were to read Diving Deep and then decide that they want to really know more about specifically about the vehicles that have been created in Japan for deep ocean exploration, that then becomes a much more mature and sophisticated topic to go learn about, right? Or if a 7th or 10th grader reads Honeybee Rescue, sees the vacuum that John Nelson has created where he vacuums the bees up and then, unvacuums them back into dumps them into the hive. And then that sets off an engineering project to figure out how exactly does the suction through a tube work to not hurt an insect, right?
Educator Michelle says, yes. I taught 4th grade and I used picture books in my classroom all the time. I had peers who used them in their high school classrooms. And I think that that's something that is often lost and unfortunate that people don't use them more often. Like in the ways you just described, Karen, they can be useful. But also, if you are teaching writing or how to approach it, for example, there's extensive back matter in my books, and the readers of my book can see they can understand my process, how I approach the research, because that's in my author's note in the back matter. And then there's additional resources they could chase down if they wanted. And in fact, when I was teaching at Lesley University in the Graduate School of Education, and I was teaching a class. Basically, it was people who are changing careers to become teachers, and they need to teach science. And many of the students that I had didn't have a really solid science education. And they would ask me, how can I prove my science knowledge? And I would say, go read children's books. Because if you have to teach a subject that's new to you, and you pick up an adult book, you might not understand all that content yet. But if you start with a children's book, you can get a really great look. All those books are so well researched now, you've got the back matter that tells you the research. So it's a great place to start, and then you can expand from there if you're the educator.
Yeah,
And
Loree?
just human citizens on a complicated planet. I mean, I think we talk so much about science literacy in this country and understanding all the very complicated things that are happening on our planet right now. a very easy way to engage people in understanding those complicated scenarios is in children's books. It's all out there. It's all been put in a form that's easily digestible, and that logically carries a reader through from beginning to end. I think there's so many children's books being made today that adults would devour if
Yes.
they knew that they were out there, and not just adults who are reading them to kids. I mean, just for their own entertainment. I sincerely
Yes.
believe this.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
I learn so much every year by reading my peers' books. I can't wait to read them, and I just learn so much
yes,
from them. Yeah.
yes, and
Yeah.
you know, I read so many children's books. People ask me all the time. I love to play trivia, Trivial Pursuit. You know, everyone wants me on their team because I can get all the. And people will say, "Why? How do you know all this like arcane stuff?" Like, do you know how many children's books I read every year? Like, I know. Of course, I know a ton of stuff.
Yeah,
You know,
no,
I don't even need
inevitably.
to go super, super, super deep. I just have this broad knowledge base. It's all being published for kids right now.
Yeah, I agree. My mom, one of the most common things my mother asks me is, "Why do you know that?" And the answer is always from a kid's book. And she just is, she marvels. I really hope that, people walk away from our conversation today not only having sort of maybe a new or renewed appreciation for how much work and time and effort goes into making nonfiction books, not only by the authors and the editors, but also, and the illustrators, of course, but also by all those experts who their names are usually in the back somewhere in a list, but they're just the most important part, I think, of making these books. And so thank you both for joining me for this conversation today. And I think that as I suspected, I thought this would be a great conversation with the two of you, and it definitely was. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you for
Karen.